So I am, as advertised, Alison Silverstein. This is the demand flexibility panel. If you're expecting a band, you're a week too late. I'm going to introduce my panelists in a minute, and I am going to add, before I forget, the very important point that at least 2 of your panel members today have bad hips. This is an hour and 45-minute session. If 1 or more of us stand up in the middle of the session, it is not an editorial comment on any of what our friends are saying here. It's because we cannot stand sitting any longer. So don't take anything amiss. If you see us wandering around on the stage behind you, we'll try not to be too creepy about it. So now that we've got that very important logistical matter out of the way, it's widely accepted that demand flexibility is going to be more valuable and economic than fast gas plants to absorb, integrate, and manage high levels of renewables. In 2024, 24% of US electric generation came from renewables. Solar and batteries, as you all know, are the dominant new capacity sources on the grid. And SPP, California, and ERCOT have all had hours when they have reached over 75% penetration of renewables within that hour itself. So where is the, and they've done so very reliably with no problems. And in some cases, they've hit 100% in some hours. So where's all the demand flexibility? Brattle estimates that only 7% of peak demand, that DR capability or demand flexibility of some type only reaches 7% of peak demand in most regions of the US. And they have estimated that it could hit 20% by 2030. I will tell you, however, that when I was a regulator, anytime someone came into our office and said, we could do this, and then they had a long list of if-onlys, anytime they start rolling out the if-onlys, you know that the odds of being able to achieve that are potentially dim. So we will try to avoid too many of the if-onlys in this conversation, but they are unavoidable and inevitable. And so we're going to wrap up with a list of everybody's favorite if-onlys. But before we get to that, I want to do a quick review of the very many different kinds of and sources of demand flexibility, because our panelists are going to talk about many of them. The first and classic is pricing, which includes dynamic rates, time of use rates, and prices to devices. Things like managed EV charging. DR, like smart demand response. I assume if you're in this room, you already know what DR means. Demand response like smart thermostats and water heaters. Virtual power plants, which include aggregated distributed energy resources, whether demand response, behind the meter batteries, PV, and the like. Large customers bidding demand into a wholesale market is a new entity, relatively speaking. ERCOT has been doing controllable loads that bid price and quantity schedules into the wholesale market, and those get dispatched by the ISO. That happens occasionally, and it happens in some ISOs and RTOs. It doesn't happen enough. And then there is aggregated small customer demand response, or a different flavor of virtual power plant. And Michael's going to be talking about that, where you aggregate a lot of individual small customers' behavior, and their aggregator manages how that feeds into the market. The one thing that is not demand flexibility, and this is going to be a tasteless dig at our friends at ERCOT, is the ISO's panic calls for voluntary conservation when facing an imminent energy shortfall. Those are not actually demand flexibility. Those are cries for help, indicating panic and the inability to figure out what's going on. And citizens who respond to that are wonderful human beings. They're also chumps because they're not being properly compensated for giving up their stuff in order to help save the grid. But they're wonderful human beings, and we appreciate them. And I'm guessing most of us who are from Texas and on this panel are among those who respond to a conservation call if and when we ever hear about it. We have a great panel today. We're going to start with Dr. Sanem Sergici of Brattle, who will talk about the ERCOT value of lost load study. Value of lost load is how customers perceive and value outages, and it's used as a proxy for the benefits of reliability. and for what you might be able to pay for achieving reliability. Dr. Angela Long of Rockwell Consulting, wave. There we go. Is going to talk about the new Lawrence Berkeley National Lab study on virtual power plant models and an inventory and some principles for how you put a VPP together. Michael Lee, whom is infamous in all the best ways here in Texas for his work with Octopus Energy, will talk about retail aggregation of demand management and behind-the-meter resources. Beth Garza of the R Street Institute and the past ERCOT Independent Market Monitor will review the role and impact of demand resources in the wholesale market and on operations to some degree. So let's get going. Sanem, you're up. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Alison, for the introduction. And thanks to all of you for showing up here. I actually was not expecting such a big crowd for an 8 o'clock panel. I know several of you are still on the West Coast time, so it's really a big thanks to everyone here. And thanks to ESIC for having me back. This is a great conference and workshop and great people. So this is always one of my favorites. So value of lost load, what does it have to do with the demand flexibility? So hopefully it will be more clear by the time I'm done with my talk here, but essentially we are going through this energy transition and we're really worried about integrating as much renewable energy as possible, doing it in an orderly fashion, making sure that reliability is not compromised. And we have to make a lot of decisions during this process as regulators, as market operators, as utility decision makers. And we need good metrics to be able to make economically sound decisions when it comes to increasing reliability, building a more robust demand flexibility portfolio. So value of lost load is a very important metric for those calculations. I think it was towards the end of 2023 that Public Utility Commission of Texas asked ERCOT to undertake a value of lost load study to determine the estimated value of electric reliability in the ERCOT region. So many of you may be familiar with the ICE calculator that is maintained by LBNL. It's typically used to derive value of lost load values. ICE calculator, as great as is, still using data from surveys that were conducted 20 years ago, where the circumstances of the grid, customer valuations of power was a lot different. So there was definitely need for undertaking a survey that is specific to Texas circumstances, and especially given the recent Storm Uri and winter reliability events that took place. So that was the motivation. And the Brattle group with our market research partner Plan Beyond, we completed a value of lost load study, which involved a primary survey of residential, commercial, industrial customers in ERCOT to determine ERCOT-specific value of lost load values. We estimated separate values for each class of customers because use cases are different for each class of customers, but we also came up with a single load-weighted average of the customer class walls to be used for ongoing commission market design efforts and to again help with the analysis of reliability standards for the ERCOT region. So what is value of lost load? WAL represents a proxy for the economic costs that customers incur due to a power outage, or it could also be thought of an average customer's willingness to pay to avoid an outage. Economic level of reliability is determined when the marginal cost of improved reliability is equal to the marginal benefit of reduced outages. So that's at that point, you've gotten your optimal level of reliability. So it's relatively easy to estimate the marginal cost of improved reliability because it's typically an engineering cost estimate. It's the plants that you need to build and transmission you need to deploy. But the benefit side is, again, tricky, and that's where WAL enters into the picture. It's like we need to know customers' valuation of the power. And Vol is typically expressed in terms of dollars per outage event. So for a 1 hour outage, what's my valuation of that avoiding that outage, or 2 hours and 8 hours? So we'll have different durations, or sometimes it's expressed in terms of dollars per unserved energy. So as I mentioned, electricity use cases are different across different customer classes. So therefore the costs will be different. The vol also differs by sector. It differs by timing of the outage, duration, frequency. It differs if the customer has a backup generation or not. If you can provide them an advance warning or not, that affects the customer's value of avoiding an outage. So we were able to survey customers on many of these different dimensions to estimate vols varying by these dimensions. Again, coming back to the use case, vol values are typically used for cost-benefit analysis for generation and transmission and distribution investments on the planning side. So you have multiple and competing investments. How do you decide which investment is more economically optimal and efficient? So you when you do your cost effectiveness analysis, value of lost load comes in as a parameter there. We also talked about informing resource adequacy and resiliency rules on the operations side. It also informs customers' valuation of reliability, obviously. Therefore, new products that could be offered to the customers and demand flexibility products, storage products, and many other new technologies are examples to this. Again, when we are creating these demand response portfolios, oftentimes, if this is done by a utility, you have to undertake a cost-benefit analysis, and most cost-benefit analysis at this time are missing the reliability value of these products, and most of the time, the desire is there, the desire to include the value of reliability there, but struggle is how can we find a reliable parameter to include in the cost-benefit analysis? So we kind of try to solve that problem for ERCOT. So as I mentioned, we estimated the vol through surveying ERCOT customers. So we gave them different outage scenarios, and there was the strategies were different for residential versus CNI customers. For residential customers, we simply asked them, there's a product that you could pay a one-time fee for. It will allow you to avoid an outage of 1 hour on a winter day in the morning, and it's a weekday. So it's just something like that. So it's a very, very well specified scenario. And now we give them a price for this product, and we ask them whether they would buy it or not. And if they'd say, no, I wouldn't buy it, we give them a lower price. So by basically changing this question multiple times for a given customer, we try to infer their willingness to pay to avoid this outage. For larger customers, strategy is different. It's more direct. We essentially ask commercial and industrial customers, what is the damage that they would incur if there was an outage, and how would that affect their business? And for the first time we ask this question, we basically make them go through a structure. Okay, would you have spoiled products? Would you lose revenue? Would you at the same time save some costs? So they go through this structured exercise, and now we start changing parameters for them. And now we report it back to the customers. So undertaking a survey is always a tedious effort, but undertaking the survey for ERCOT was really something else, because ERCOT does not have a direct interface with the end use customer. So if I'm working with a utility can email, call, directly reach out its customers to ask these questions. ERCOT did not have the means to do that. So we had to jump through a lot of hoops. And at the end of the day, we were able to utilize this data that retail providers provide ERCOT called customer billing contact information. So for each of the customers that they serve on a monthly basis, reps provide ERCOT with the name of the customer, their address, their email address, and we were obviously filtered for some of this information because of PAI purposes. But the purpose of that file is that if some of these reps go bankrupt, that ERCOT would be aware and then would find another default provider for these customers. In any case, we use the CBCI to reach out to residential customers and some commercial and industrial customers. There are also non-opt-in entities in Texas, right? Like not all of the co-ops and munis and utilities are providing this list. So we also had to work with non-opt-in entities to have them directly implement this survey for their own customers, because the commission wanted this survey to be representative of the entire Texas and ERCOT territory. So we had to do all those. So at the end of the day, the survey data was collected between March and May 2024. About 3,000 residential customers responded, and about 1,700 CNI customers responded. Strong, I would say, relatively okay completion rates. And we then took this data and implemented statistical models, and I am not going to get into those details for your sake here, but all the details are provided in our report. We estimated discrete choice logit models. Let me just talk about our definition of the customer classes. So even though we were trying to refresh the data in the LBNL surveys, we also wanted this information to be useful for LBNL's purposes going forward, because they are starting a process in which they will update their ICE calculator. So we kind of try to stay close to their original survey design. So LBNL surveys were our starting point, and we also had to stick with their definition of different customer classes just so they can use our data. So for our purposes, again, residential customers as identified by CBCI, small CNI customers are defined as with annual usage less than 50 megawatt hours. Medium CNI customers are customers with annual usage greater than 50 megawatt hours and less than 4,500 megawatt hours. And large CNI customers are those with annual usage greater than 4,500 megawatt hours. And all CNI customers have completed the same survey. And we had a relatively small sample of very large customers. So we ended up combining large customers with the medium CNI customers to be able to estimate their vol values. All right, so the table on the right-hand side of the slide is essentially presenting our vol estimates per event. As I mentioned, we express the vol numbers two ways per event. Like for a 1 hour event, what's customers' valuation of electricity? But I will also present these numbers in terms of vol per unserved megawatt hours. So this is for each customer class. The average customer in that class, let's say for residential customer, for 1 hour event, a residential customers would be willing to pay up to $7 to avoid that outage.
Million residential customer, call it 10 million residential customers in ERCOT. This value would mean in 1 hour outage is $70 million.
Yeah, exactly. You could multiply those values by the numbers. That's how they enter into cost benefit analysis. And I mean, as you can see, the vol per event increases as the duration of the outage event increases, but it increases at a decreasing rate. For small CNI customers, they range from $1,200 to $7,300. For medium and large customers, again, they range from $7,400 to $49,000. I mean, these are obviously large numbers, and especially for the CNI customers. But again, just think about the disruptions to their operations when they have to deal with the impacts of these outages. And another point that I want to make is that all the numbers reported here are for a weekday afternoon events, irrespective of the season. So one of the big questions from this study was that do customers' value of lost load numbers change by season? Because historically, all the outage events focus were the summer seasons. You know, we saw these outage events most likely in the summer seasons, but obviously with the change in climate patterns, we're seeing more and more of the winter events. So in our study, we found that customers are equally concerned about summer outage events as they are concerned about the winter outage events. So we did not find any statistically significant difference between their walls between summer and winter season. So therefore, our numbers here are like season agnostic and therefore a weekday afternoon period. So another interesting observation is that costs are substantially largest in the infrastructure sector, and this sector includes refineries and data centers. So for the infrastructure center, we for a 1 hour event, we found that the cost is $50,000, and that's like almost 5-fold higher than the next sector, which is manufacturing, which is $8,500. Then that is almost double the cost for the remaining sectors, such as healthcare, customer industries, and so on. We also found that advanced warning of outages is more effective at reducing the cost for small C&I customers than larger customers. When we provided advanced warning to medium and large customers, their VOL estimates fell by approximately 20%, whereas for smaller customers, smaller C&I customers, that they fell by more than 35%. And that goes back to, again, having some backup generation and other means to be able to mitigate the impacts of outages for larger customers. So here, this is essentially the same information, but note that now we're expressing the value of lost load on a per unserved megawatt hour. So what we do is we take wall per event, let's say for 1 hour, and we divide that number by the unserved megawatt hours for that 1 hour by class. So this is essentially a transformation of the per event numbers on an unserved megawatt hour basis. And these numbers are just much larger because, again, we're dividing that original estimate by the unserved megawatt hour. And residential estimates are, again, ranging from almost $4,000 per unserved megawatt hours to $1,000. You will notice that as the duration increases, the wall per unserved megawatt hour decreases. It's because as you have more hours in the duration in the outage, that you get to divide it by a much larger unserved megawatt hours. So that's why there's this pattern of wall decreasing as the outage duration is increasing. And as you will notice, small C&I customers have the very large wall estimates, and that's followed by the medium and large customers. As I mentioned, ERCOT was really interested in a one single wall metric that represents the entire ERCOT territory. So we essentially took these numbers, we population weighted them, we load weighted them, and we provided the ERCOT-wide wall estimates that are listed in the last column of this table. And for a 1 hour duration, the wall per unserved megawatt hour for ERCOT is officially estimated as $35,685. And the PUC accepted this number as the official wall metric to be used in their cost benefit analysis, including transmission, distribution, and generation related investments. So wrapping up here, just a few key takeaways. So I already mentioned this first one, but a big finding was that customers' wall did not differ across seasons, as well as during the daytime. So they were all statistically insignificant, those differences based on our survey. So we found that advanced warning lowered customers' value of lost load for all customer classes. And we've also done a literature review before starting this study. We found that our wall estimates for residential customers in Texas are on the lower side of the distribution, whereas medium and large CNI estimates are comparable to walls from other studies. You know, we looked at some other international studies, some other US studies, which are generally more outdated. But for small CNI customers, our wall estimates are really at the high end of the literature review. So for small CNI, our numbers are quite high. And it's the reason for this is actually going back to the definition of the small CNI customers we used following the LBNL survey. These are very small mom and pop stores, and just very small businesses. And obviously the impact of an outage on these businesses is quite substantial because their livelihood depends on their businesses to stay open. They also don't have the means such as backup generation and other, transportation opportunities that like large customers would have. So that's the end of my slides. But going back to the demand flexibility point, I do a lot of these cost benefit analysis for my mostly utility clients, and we always talk about these unquantified benefits in these cost benefit analysis, and oftentimes an unquantified benefit would be increased reliability, because demand flexibility allows you to be more flexible and make sure that you do not, you have sufficient capacity to be able to serve the load and rely on those customers who are willing to reduce their usage. So if you're able to, again, start incorporating value of reliability more often in these cost benefit analysis, I think that we will see a lot more portfolios passing that cost effectiveness criteria. It doesn't guarantee that they will be implemented, but there's another question which I'll let my fellow panelists to touch upon. Thank you.
And now, Dr. Angela Rockwell. I'm sorry, Angela Long of Rockcress Consulting. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for showing up so early. So I'm here to talk about virtual power plants. I just want to first acknowledge that while I'm the lead author on this study, I didn't do it by myself. Natalie Mims-Frick from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and Ryan Long from Rockcress Consulting also contributed to this report. Also want to thank the U.S. Department of Energy, the prior administration, for funding this study, and also be very clear that I'm not here representing DOE or LBNL, but I'm representing Rockcress. So our study for virtual power plants really sought out to have 3 research objectives: understanding what it takes to scale virtual power plants, looking at what type of business models you need to implement a VPP, and then looking at the landscape and the magnitude of virtual power plants. Our study originally started off as an interview approach. We interviewed 20 subject matter experts across the US, everybody from solution providers to public utility commissions to utilities of various sizes. We wanted to look at 5 different themes. How do you design and deploy a VPP? What are the grid operations and planning needs for a virtual power plant? What's the regulatory and policy environment? Looking at business models, like I said earlier, and then what are the factors that lead to successful virtual power plants? That interview process started off with our first report in this project, which is our Insights into Scaling VPPs. We organized all of our interview findings into 3 high-level themes, and then we conducted 7 utility-specific case studies. We really wanted to focus on our utility case studies being geographically diverse, but also diverse in the type of utility. So IOUs in markets, munis, IOUs not in markets, things like that. The one thing I'll say is all of our findings from all of our interviews are cataloged in the appendix of this report. So if you really want to dive deep and learn everything that we learned, you can go there. At the highest level, these three things that we found about successful VPPs really boil down to the role of leadership within a virtual power plant design, whether that's internally with executive management at the utility level, or that's leadership at the policy and regulator level. It's really important to set vision and a goal and make sure that you have dedicated staff for that successful VPP design. Also, virtual power plants, unlike traditional demand response, they take a lot of investment into grid operation, software integration. They're very different than how you think about how we've traditionally implemented energy efficiency and demand response. And that causes a lot of need for protocols, standardization, from everything from communication to how we even define VPPs. And then lastly, looking at program design, which really the best designed VPPs are a collaborative effort among customers and businesses and utilities, as well policymakers. And the best designed VPPs set metrics that help you quickly scale from a pilot to a program. So one of the things that we heard over and over again is that there is no one size fits all definition for VPPs. So we actually went out and looked at 30 different definitions of how people define VPPs, and we found that that is true. There's various definitions on how people look at designing a VPP, but there was some clear kind of themes that arose from the definitions that we looked at. A solid VPP is designed with goals and objectives, so people know what you're doing and why you're doing it. It's usually designed with with a diverse set of aggregated DERs, sorry. And so that's a combination of demand, storage, and generation. It has clear goals for grid services and flexibility, and considers the integration of software and controls. After looking at all of those definitions, we found this need to create profiles and an inventory. So our VPP profiles and inventory report does that. The first thing the report looked at is what are the conceptual models, the various types of virtual power plants that you could have, and how could we create some framework around those models to help facilitate conversations among various parties, but also start to be able to help think about different business models. So our first profile that we created is called aggregated. It's the most simplest, basic type of virtual power plant you can have. It typically is just one type of DER, so think smart thermostat program. You're usually doing it a day or calling your virtual power plant a day ahead, but your critical component here is that you really are focused on grid operations and grid services and benefits. So while it's still highly customer focused, it's really not as dynamic, I think, as some of your other VPP types that we'll talk about. So really just providing kind of that minimal DER coordination and primarily energy and capacity at the bulk system. One thing I didn't mention, I should have, is that these profiles are not linear. They're not mutually exclusive. You as a utility can have more than one of these. You can start at aggregated or you can start at orchestrated. It really depends on what type of program design you have, what type of customers, what type of DERs you have in your system. The integrated VPP, the key here is visibility and control. You're really trying to aggregate a diverse set of DERs and make sure that you're meeting grid services, and you're starting to have enhanced workforce functions. So you move from a traditional customer program team to a DER team or a distributed resource planning team. And you're trying to shift and shed and shape load with this type of VPP. Integrated VPPs are probably the most common when you get to orchestrated VPPs, they are not as common. They are a lot more sophisticated. You've now moved from just thinking about serving the bulk system to now thinking about how can your virtual power plant provide benefits all the way to the grid edge. So you're essentially doing distribution system operations with your VPP, and you're integrating software like an ADMS and a DERMS. So an integrated VPP, you might have an edge DERMS, but with a orchestrated VPP, you're gonna have a system that your grid operators can actually see and utilize that resource real time. And it could be integrated into your customer service systems as well, other enterprise systems. The thing about the orchestrated VPP is you're really starting to think about resiliency at the customer level. And so you're providing all of those benefits. Once we started to catalog different profiles of VPPs, we realized we had collected a lot of research on different VPPs that we had looked at. We didn't intend to make an inventory. We really were just trying to see what are the differences among different program designs. And all of a sudden we had almost 200 different virtual power plants that we had cataloged. When we started looking at them, we started bucketing them into high level categories, and just to see where are they located, who's implementing them, what type of details can we find on them, and what type of DERs are within those VPPs. And then we noticed quite a few virtual power plants had equity attributes, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the inventory that we created is publicly available. You can go in there and search and look at what we've collected. Just know that this is a collection of news articles, press releases, word of mouth. It is just a way that we could start to pull together everything we had heard about VPPs, because there was no publicly available source at that point. So if you go in there and you find something that needs change, just email me and we can fix it and update it. So the VPP inventory is broken into 2 data sets. The first is research. That is the one where we collected all the information we could on different VPPs. We have about 19 gigawatts of, I would say, potential virtual power plant capacity, just because certain VPPs are at various stages. Some are being actively implemented and some are very ambitious in our goals. And you can see here that they're across the US, but mostly where you see VPPs is in California. Once we cataloged all of the virtual power plants that we had been doing research on, we wanted to see how does that compare to traditional demand response and existing solar and battery that's on the system today, on the grid today. So we pulled in EIA data. We cleaned that data and made sure that we didn't have any duplicates, that if it was already captured in our research database, we excluded it from our EIA data set. And we started to see, what if we used existing traditional demand response and solar and battery and use that to scale VPPs? What could be the potential, and what are the top states that have the ability to quickly scale VPPs? And we found that there's about 27 gigawatt hours or gigawatts of existing capacity today that we could leverage to scale VPPs. Lastly, we looked at virtual power plants that had equity attributes, and we found that when a VPP is designed with customer community in mind, whether it's thinking about having your DERs be specific for resiliency or thinking about helping rural communities, those VPPs actually led to more grid value because they tended to be more diverse. And so we saw that there was actually a direct connection between really planning for your customer and your customer needs to maximizing the grid services and value that you could have. So just wrapping up my presentation here, One of the findings that we had is IOUs are a big driver for utility or for virtual power plants. They make up more than 60% of the virtual power plants that are live today. They're primarily demand response and typically just demand. So we do have a combination of virtual power plants that are demand, storage, and generation, but most of what we have today that is actually on the ground being used is demand response. Our equity-focused VPPs, there are about 40 of those that we classified, and that made up 8 gigawatt hours of potential. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but they tend to be more diverse in the types of products that they offer. So they would do demand response, and then they would also have energy storage or solar. And I think the last thing I want to touch on is just as you start to define a VPP and starting to think about what does that mean for you, the critical component is making sure that you're aggregating those DERs and that you're really utilizing it as a grid resource. That is the key finding from our report. Okay. Next. Leave that up there.
While Michael is coming to the podium, I want to observe that Angela's excellent research focused on utility virtual power plants, or where the utility is integral to the formation and operation of the VPP. Welcome to ERCOT, y'all. In ERCOT, only munis and co-ops are allowed to have that kind of relationship with the customer. And since most of our operations are, we have a technical hitch, so I get to talk longer. So what that means is here, because the utility is a transmission, and that the investor-owned transmission and distribution utility is not allowed to have a retail relationship with the end-use customer, which means that here, VPPs and this kind of aggregation, that everything in Angela's typology, we would not have any IOU transmission distribution utility coordinated or integrated VPPs. All we are allowed to have is the aggregated VPP, and one of the most successful aggregators in Texas is Octopus Energy, which was run for many glorious years by my friend Michael Lee, who is no longer with Octopus and therefore is wholly unshackled and is going to dish about retail aggregation of demand response and DERs and where it could go and what it could be. But so do understand, one of the things we are in the unusual circumstance, I don't think I've ever been at a conference where all of the panelists talked shorter than the amount of time we gave them. So we're going to have a lot of time for questions, and I apologize, but I'm going to be asking you some while they're thinking up what they're going to do. Michael, hit it.
Thanks, Alison. I've always been unshackled a bit, and I think my comments have gotten me into trouble before. So, hi everybody. My name is Michael. Formerly the CEO of Octopus Energy in the U.S. Octopus is still a startup, although a $10 billion startup. Octopus has grown into nearly 10 million customers globally, serves about 12 different countries, and really is reinventing what it means to serve a customer in a lot of different markets. As a former CEO, I made my own slides, so they're not very pretty. As you can imagine, that muscle has been lost over the years, but they're just to the point so that I think are abstraction for the things that I love to communicate about what I think is the most undervalued resource on the grid today: customer load flexibility, especially residential load. So I like to say Texas sometimes is a window into the future. When you think about residential customers here, some kind of baseline stats, a lot of people are from a lot of different places. Our residential customers on average use 10 to 20 megawatt hours a year. And those we have quite a few already that have already undergone the energy transition. They have electrified. We have many customers that have fully electric cooking, heating, hot water, electric vehicles, and those customers use up to 50 megawatt hours a year. So when you think about your grid and powering your residential customers, as you think about them electrifying loads that are historically fossil fuel based or molecule based and move them into the electron world, they're going to look like you have millions of small commercial customers, not residential customers. And that's going to really stress the grid if we just take our current grid and multiply it by a factor of 2 or 3. The cost inflation to go build all that CapEx is going to really be challenging. When you think about residential customers today, that 10 to 20 megawatt hours a year, that looks a lot like customers who go through the heating energy transition and do a heat pump over time. And when you think about that residential customer, 60% of the volume to go serve that customer is controlled by that thermostat. And when you think about the timing of the consumption of that volume, the actual overall 80% of the cost to serve that customer is those kilowatt hours. So residential customers have a high concentration of heating and cooling, and the timing of those generally is when the grid is stressed. In fact, you could look at it inversely. That is why the grid is stressed. You know, commercial industrial customers are not building twice as much product on a hot August afternoon. It's a residential customer is blasting the air conditioning. And in January, again, C&I customers aren't creating 2 or 3x more product. It's residential customers going through heating. And so what you have to reimagine the problem to be the solution. How do you think about the core elements of managing these customers to turn them into your biggest asset instead of your biggest liability? Right now, we have very weak telemetry with a lot of customers. Here in Texas, we actually have great telemetry because we have smart meters, 99% of places. We have smart thermostats. Many places that don't have smart meters, it's literally the difference between being an Amazon versus Kmart. And a lot of places are still stuck in the 80s. You have very weak telemetry to who's doing what, when, and what customers actually prefer. And we'll kind of get into that in a little bit here. As you think about electric vehicles, you know, each one of these, depending on the mileage driven, we have very high vehicle miles traveled here in Texas, but call it 3 to 7 megawatt hours per year of consumption, depending on the mileage. And over time, we see a lot of opportunity for electric vehicles to not just intelligently charge, but intelligently isolate loads on the grid or even push back to the grid. And that is a very exciting opportunity. And finally, light bulbs. They literally don't matter anymore. They don't matter. Stop thinking about light bulbs. So many light bulbs have been converted into LEDs. They use 5 to 10 kilowatts, or sorry, 5 to 10 watts per bulb. I can have nearly all the lights on in my house 24/7, and it's like having a TV on. It does not stress the grid. We are not stuck in the 80s anymore with incandescents. And so we have new challenges besides turning off the lights. I know my habits die hard. I'm going around turning off lights in my daughter's room every time we go out. But that actually doesn't matter anymore. What really matters are very different things, and we need to rethink how to manage residential customers. So I'll do a little bit of a case study, and I'll talk to you about how we achieved what we achieved. So this is back in August. We had, you know, I was actually getting out of a baseball game, went to the Astros game this night. It was 95 degrees and 90% humidity in Houston at about 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. It was hot. It was extremely hot, and it was even hotter up in Dallas. And this is when we had a $5,000 price event momentarily. And being a Texan, I make the joke, we have 2 things here in Texas. We have guns and we have air conditioning. We protect our air conditioning with our guns. And so a lot of people think customers are inflexible with thermostats. And I'd like to prove you wrong. I'd like to prove you wrong. It just comes to incentives, and it comes to understanding customers. We were able to achieve, during this flexibility event, working with our customers, we were able to achieve a 50% reduction in thermostat usage, consumption, during these peak hours. And our override rates, meaning when we send a command out to a thermostat, our override rates were just under 10%. So the vast majority of customers came along with us on that journey. And the challenge is, you can't start with this end goal and try to force it. Right now, what we call demand response is probably too antiquated for the grid of the future. We're all thinking in the world of grid operations. Push a button and make 100 megawatts go away. That phrase is probably the most customer unfriendly phrase in the world. That is like a very grid-centric orientation, not a customer-centric orientation. So in order to achieve these types of results of extreme grid flexibility, we actually need to focus on the customer. We need to understand who is even at home, who even cares about what temperatures, what's the thermal envelope of each individual customer, what's the opportunity for changing their thermostat. Some customers keep their thermostats higher at, say, 77 degrees, others are at 72, 75. What's the temperature sensitivity people have to when you do issue a command? Do you want to even notify them before you do a flexibility event, or sometimes you just want to do it in the background? All of these are customization to the individual customer. Again, Kmart versus Amazon. Amazon takes, when you order something, they take all the metadata behind you to figure out what it takes you to get to the next level. Kmart did none of that. And so when we think about the opportunity for doing grid flexibility, it's frankly not about the grid, it's about the customer. And it's using metadata and running A/B experiments going into an event to understand each individual customer's tolerance and threshold and opportunity and ability to load flex, and how long of a flexibility event you can do before they give you an override, which is a very great signal when you're doing a test. So that way, when you do have a flexibility event, you know exactly how to custom tailor that event to that customer. And when you do that, you get the results that you want, not because you cared about the 100 megawatts going away, but because you cared about understanding and using the metadata of the smart meters, the metadata of the thermostats, to really build a comprehensive individual profile of one, and not just, here's my residential customers that have this type of thermostat, let me just slam the button and make the megawatts go away. That's a very high attrition, high override, and you're not going to get a true asset out of that. You're going to get a lot of customers complaining and leaving the program. I guess real quick, before I move on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about rate design. One of the things that we have as a retailer is that, like utilities, we have the ability to think about rate design. Unlike utilities, we have the ability to experiment with rate design really quickly. There's no approval process here in Texas to thinking of a new rate. And your rate is a function of your P&L structure, your cost structure. If you have too low of a rate, you'll go out of business. If you have too high of a rate, you won't win any business and you'll also go out of business. So as a retailer, we think really comprehensively about the rates that we charge a customer, as well as our cost structure for delivering electricity to that customer. In a grid of the past, we had very tight distribution of outcomes for what electricity costs. If it was gas on the margin or coal on the margin, power prices kind of swung 30 bucks each way. In the world of renewables, there is huge price swings in the wholesale power market that influence our costs. So if we can help customers consume power when it's super cheap, and then shed load when it's really expensive, then as a for-profit retailer, that's in our financial interest. And we get to experiment to see if the things that we're designing have any customer uptake. Of course, we can study it for years, but at the end of the day, if we present an offer in front of a customer and they don't understand it, or they don't like it, or they prefer something else, that is the truest feedback loop of commercialization of a product, to see if the things that we're offering are even interesting to customers. And sometimes this failure to launch is the biggest failure of all when trying to think about demand response. It's death by committee and people thinking instead of actually asking and doing and launching and iterating. And that's a very different skill set, I think. It's a very different approach given the planning orientation that a lot of utilities have in this market. But by doing this, we've effectively created a product where, yes, you can buy power for 15 cents. That's broadly the market price here in Texas. But by the way, if you integrate your thermostat, it comes down to 12 cents. And if you integrate your EV, it comes down to 10 cents. And what I mean by integration is you still pay the same fixed rate all throughout the year, but the load serving entity has the optionality built into the contract of how and when to use that device for the things that we're seeing on the grid. You know, we'll talk a little bit about time of use rates, you know, simple flat rates, and then what this is the next evolution, which I call smart rates. So that way we have optionality built into the structure for the load serving entity. And when you really put those customers first, you can do really interesting things. So this on the left is a competition. So we get really excited about thermostats, batteries, and electric vehicles and smart management of these assets. And so what we did is that we had a competition to say, look, we will give you 100% of your exports back to the grid. And one would say 100%, Octopus, how do you make any money? Well, it's actually in our interest because then we don't have to buy any power in that interval. So I'm more than happy to give that 100% of export credit, that real-time export credit to customers. And sometimes it was $5 a kilowatt hour. And so customers were gaming the system to say, when is the highest price and how do they export it back if they want to do it manually? And if they want to give us control, we'll help them too. And some of those customers were making, you know, up to $1,000 in a single month for being not a virtual power plant, but a real power plant, sending real kilowatt hours back to the grid. And by the way, in the pockets of the grid where the grid needed it the most. So we didn't have any T&D costs to transport that power. And so I think, if anything, those customers got shortchanged because they were not able to realize the value of selling to their neighbor who was 20 feet away, whereas all they got was just the energy portion and not a credit for the T or D portion that is extremely valuable as we rethink our power systems. And you can see how we interact with our customers. It's not a bunch of jargon. It's not black and white. It is how do you bring some pop and how do you consumerize this invisible product? You know, we're already bringing a product based on trust that customers can't hold. Now we're talking about device management. That is a high trust product. Does your organization have the brand trust to go manage customers? I think right now, a lot of organizations don't. And I think they need to kind of reinvent themselves in order to get there. Again, some of the contests that we run, this is another one where I talked about earlier, they were making up to $1,000 a month just for timing their exports back to the grid. So residential customers, their usage is going to explode. And these liabilities can turn into some of our biggest assets. Because as we think about solar and batteries especially, these assets are Legos, they're modular. The same batteries that go onto the 100 megawatt front of the meter battery packs are the same ones that go inside the behind the meter ones. Like they're just literally smaller sizes of those same Legos. And so we need to rethink, how do we value customers who are selling effectively to each other several feet away? And how do we incentivize them to become some of our biggest generators during the most critical times? Because we don't need to build all the T&D networks that we're currently building. I would propose we think a lot about peaker plants. We have these peaking assets that are utilized just for a handful of hours a year. And we're kind of in a path right now to build a T&D system that's a peaker plant as well. That's vastly underutilized for many hours a year. And the cost structure of building multi-billion-dollar T&D systems just for a handful of hours is going to create such an inflation cost spiral because you're only going to get a handful of hours of throughput to pay for it. The other way of achieving the exact same outcome is to have generation be produced more locally and reward those people who are your own customers to also become a producer. And there's a great analogy. It's called Uber. In the old world, we used to think about, in order to solve a supply side challenge of taxis, you had to build more taxis. Actually, we can turn some of your customers into suppliers, and you can incentivize them to think about their usage behavior, such as changing price incentives throughout shifting their demand throughout the day. But it's going to be really hard to ask the taxi company to go invent Uber. And I think the exact same challenges that we're dealing with today. How do you have a centralized grid build the decentralized future? That is very, very, very hard. Again, how do we unlock the value of T and D? Many T and D systems, I've heard the joke before that a doorbell is smarter in some ways than some of our grid. We have more visibility to what's happening in our smart doorbells than we do to some of our grid. Microsynchrophasers are rarely used on the distribution system. We have very weak state estimation for power flows and where things are going until a transformer blows out, and then we're like, wow, there's a problem on this piece of the network. Maybe we should go fix it. It's kind of too late at that point. But if we were able to measure power flows very locally, we could compensate people for these value streams that they're creating to sell power to their neighbors. And that's a very different vision. That's a very different model than where the train's going right now. And then finally, we need to think of new deflationary cost curves. We are on the path for highly inflationary cost curves, massive underutilization of our T&D system, and we're building even more massive utilization of our T&D system. Instead, we can get to very similar outcomes by not only utilizing it better by load shifting, but paying customers to export to the grid locally where we need it. And in this world of inflation, where campaigns have been run on inflation, that's a huge opportunity to have a deflationary cost environment. And when we have access to super cheap electricity, we will have customers accelerate their journey onto the energy transition if they have the ability to buy and sell to their neighbors. So what's the challenge? What are the gating items? A lot of different people from a lot of different orgs. The highest level one effectively comes to either incentives or culture. You know, this is not a technology issue. We can build capability. It's just incentive or culture. So on the classical IOUs, if there's a CapEx bias, then yes, this is not a CapEx solution. And so that is a challenge. How do you rate base this? It's a lot easier to build another T&D network, some power plants down the road, instead of more locally generating electrons during very specific hours. So that's going to be a challenge to rethink the incentive structure for IOUs and their classic way that they're currently making money. On munis, what I've tend to found as I've interacted with various munis, as city council has to regulate broadly, or has a say at least, within the municipal construct. What we're talking about here is enabling people to participate and potentially have different rates based on your flexibility. And it kind of comes down to the principle of, well, every customer has a different cost onto the system. How can you reward customers for having less of a cost to the system? And in the beginning, it's going to be those with EVs and batteries and thermostats. And kind of like the iPhone, there were a few people that got the iPhone at the beginning. And over time, because we've had such broad adoption, we've been able to drive out the cost of the iPhone, and it has nearly ubiquitous uptake. So maybe the first handful of people are the ones in this case that are the first early adopters of the iPhone. And yes, that may feel a bit unfair that different people get rates, but cost structure on the power grid is nonlinear. So even if a handful of people support grid flexibility, it creates a more efficient grid for everyone else who is not being flexible. So it still has overall benefits, even for people who are not early adopters. And finally, for co-ops, talent pools. You know, co-ops range in size from very big to very small. Of course, many are very small. In fact, my grandfather used to string lines up in North Dakota for the REA. That's a very hard market to support, given the high fragmentation and the extremely localized decision-making that happens on the co-op side. So how do we build the capacity that's not inherent in the organizations of today. And then finally, my background is retail. So retail, we're used to in retail buying a hedge and selling it. And that is everything of retail 1.0 is where everyone's naturally thinking that retail is not good for customers. And I agree. I'm not convinced that the old world of retail was that good. I'm not saying it was always bad, but it had some serious flaws to the model, which is try to buy a hedge, lock customers into a contract and hope they buy variable rate products at the end because they forgot 12 months later. Of course, those who are shopping are getting a great deal. And those who are not, it's a harder product. But in retail 2.0, it's not about that at all. Because buying a hedge and selling it is very imperfect. The load shapes of a customer do not cleanly match the hedge. And a retailer figuring out the imbalance of its portfolio, sometimes being long and sometimes being short, will cause that retailer to really struggle financially. And we've seen this. We see it actively today. We've seen it over the past few years. As ERCOT has had grid volatility, it has really reduced the amount of competition in ERCOT because the old retailers don't have the ability to manage their portfolio very well. But in retail 2.0, it's actually not about buying a hedge and marketing it. It's about the fine granular data of understanding a customer and effectively taking the concepts of C&I, which is understanding the load shape and the cost of that customer, and effectively giving them a custom rate based on their ability and when they buy power, and doing that for residential customers. Right now, we kind of peanut butter spread what we think a residential customer costs. But the reality is we saw the wide ranging outcomes as far as how much electrification they've gone through, how flexible they are, when do they buy power? Again, 80% of the usage, the cost structure is all about the thermostat. And if you can manage that one customer's thermostat, there's a very different cost structure to that customer versus one who is inflexible. And so it's all about thinking about user experience, metadata, which customers you want to pre-cool and to what degree going into the event, and then how long of an event can you do and how frequent can you do it? For someone who works from home, they're actually going to have a lot less flexibility than someone going to the office. Someone going to the office, you can see the metadata in their smart meters. You can pre-cool their house in the middle of the summer when it's super sunny outside and cost of power is pretty much zero, especially when all that's made by local DG power that is kind of self-supplying on that feeder line. You can think about the house as a big thermal battery and pre-cool it. So that way at 5:30, 6 o'clock, they're not touching their thermostat. They're not even thinking about it because they're comfortable already, even as the grid is starting to escalate in price. And so it's rethinking the role of what is the purpose of a load serving entity? And it has the perfect opportunity to interface with the customer as well as interface with the wholesale power markets. And none of this is actually aggregated. We talk a lot about aggregations. The reality is when you have smart meters and you clear on each individual smart meter's load, then you have a customer of one. And when you have a customer of one, you want to understand each customer. And when you want to understand each customer, you want to really build trust and you want to enable that customer to get into the flexibility journey. So with that, I'll leave my comments.
Thanks, Michael. And now Beth Garza, the woman who needs no slides.
I may not have slides, but because I was too lazy to put them together. So yeah, if we're not, I'm going to close that so I can put my notes up here. I hope that doesn't screw anything up. Thanks for having me. I have the unenviable position of being, following a tough act. I always enjoy listening to Michael. I love his, we are generationally different. I try very hard not to react to much of what he says with my grumpy old lady reaction. But I always appreciate his vision and view. I appreciate Sanem's work on the vol study and the perspective and the addition of what that means for what we should be doing, what we think our customers want, how to assess that. And Angela, your the work on trying to just document DRRs and what does that mean? Again, from a customer perspective, what can we do to improve from the grid? So I was asked to try to talk about the, kind of the value from the wholesale market perspective of all of this demand flexibility. And I start with, I can't help myself. I always sort of, put myself on the journey of where did I begin 40 years ago and where are we now? And, in the wholesale world, it used to be, demand was what we forecasted it to be. And, we built big blocks of generation to try to meet as much demand as we could expect there to be. And frankly, the bigger and faster we could build those chunks of supply, the more efficient it was. And that's what was driving down cost. And frankly, I think in the late 90s, we culminated with lots of money being spent on those big blocks of supply. And all of a sudden we're like, where's the new money going to come from? And that was, in my view, kind of what fostered the new age of competitive supply that we are in today, is the need to access additional capital. I see a future, and Michael again mentioned it, I call it it's the decentralization of capital investment. He mentioned kind of the Uber model or the Airbnb model, right? How can we as a society benefit on the electricity side? How is we collectively derive value from individuals' capital investments and decentralizing that? You can think about that as just being more customer responsive, or at a macro level, in the way I'm thinking about it. So I think the other thing I wanted to just amplify again from Michael, I feel like I'm repeating a lot, but he showed you the peakiness and the reliance of, the impact of the thermostat, if you will, on customers and customer demand. If we look at it at a wholesale level in the ERCOT market, the winter peak demand, the estimate is about 41% of the total winter peak is weather sensitive. That's the thermostat, right? That's primarily residents and small commercial consumers trying to stay warm in their homes and places of business. Similarly, on the summer peak, it's again about 35% of total demand is weather sensitive. Another way to look at it is if I look at the total demand in ERCOT, and I rank that from highest to lowest, the top 10 gigawatts of load occurred in roughly 800 hours. So less than 10% of the time, there's 10 gigawatts of demand being drawn on. If I change that view of of just total customer demand to net load, that is customer demand minus wind minus solar, that same 10 gigawatts of net load occurred in roughly 300 hours. So only about 3.5% of the time. So now you're starting to get to time, you start to see the peakiness of the system and the reasonableness, if you will, of being able to adjust customers' demand in a way that's helpful and to fully utilize the installed capacity or the installed capabilities that we already have. I think Alison in her introduction talked about controllable load resources in ERCOT, and that's a definition that's existed for many years. Here recently has become more utilized. And I don't have any good data on that because I don't have good data. Somebody can do it, but where that controllable load resource function is primarily being used is by batteries indicating when do I want to charge, at what price do I want to buy electricity to charge myself. And that it's being used by certainly multiple dozens of facilities currently selecting, basically bidding to buy energy in the real-time market. And I think that's my view of the future. Is from a wholesale perspective, it's let me diverge a little bit here, digress a little bit. If we think about my former colleagues, my former PhD economist colleagues used to just cringe when I'd say, well, economics is easy. It's just demand, supply, price, right? How hard is it? How hard can it be? But it really is just demand, supply, price. And in tradition, in basic economics, we think of all of that demand as a curve and supply as a curve, and where they intersect, that's our price. In real-time electricity markets, historically, that demand is not a curve, it's a vertical line. And we stack up supply against it. And I hold out hope, that through a variety of programs and customer involvement and different ways of managing costs and controllable load resources is one of those ways, we'll start to see that demand not be assumed to be just a vertical line, to actually be a curve that is intersected. And that becomes an opportunity for, I believe, a more efficient utilization of the existing resources that we have, and reduces potentially the need for additional resources going forward. Just to put in a plug for some of the large load discussion that is ubiquitous at this point, right? Those actions, the actions of these large block consumers potentially, and their potential flexibility and the impact on the overall demand supply picture becomes even more important. And because you can talk to sort of a handful of individuals or specific individual interactions, that's different than the opportunities that we've heard in terms of aggregating hundreds or thousands of customers to try to get to that benefit. I think I continue to hold out hope that, or hold out not just hope, optimism that what we're seeing going forward is not just, let's just try to do it. Let me digress a little bit. In a lot of ways, electricity system planning is very much like transportation planning. Do we build bigger roads for more cars, or do we do different kinds of things to encourage more throughput for vehicles? And I think the arguments and the situations are very similar between the two industries. And in my, frankly, I don't know about y'all, but I would much prefer to drive down a formerly busy street that's now been condensed and has traffic circles and allows me to move continuously than to fight the 12 lanes of traffic that exist on I-10 trying to go back and forth to Houston. That's my personal preference, frankly. And I think similarly, do we just try to keep building bigger and bigger and bigger? Attitude from an electricity system is not the way forward. We have to become smarter and more enabling for demand to express their willingness to pay. And that then unleashes the ability for consumers to differentiate themselves along their willingness to pay. And that's how you get the most economic or the most efficient solution for all of us. So with that, I'll wrap up my ad-libbed remarks here and look forward to Allison's really tough and insightful questions.